The music played on behind her, but Maren no longer heard it. She stood very still in the middle of Lady Phipps's ballroom, and the heat of 300 candles pressed against her skin, and the smell of beeswax and rosewater was so thick she could taste it at the back of her throat. The silk of her borrowed gown felt wrong against her body. It was too fine for her. It had been Lady Alderton's gift, pressed into her hands that afternoon with a firm look and a single word: wear it. So she wore it. She had worn it like armor. She was not sure when the room had turned. One moment she had been standing near the wall with Lady Alderton, watching the dancers, and the next she had felt the weight of eyes on her. Not one pair. Many. The way people look at something that does not belong. It had started with the Duke. Alistair Hale, the Duke of Thornwood, had crossed the ballroom floor toward her. He was not a man who smiled easily. He was broad across the shoulders and slow in his movements, and when he walked into a room, the servants straightened without knowing they were doing it. He had come straight to her. Past the daughter of an earl who had been placed in his path. Past Lady Cordelia Marsh, who had been watching him all evening with the sharp stillness of a cat at a mouse hole. He had stopped in front of Maren and said her name. Maren. Just her name. As if he had always known it, as if it were a word he used often. She had looked up at him. His eyes were grey and heavy, and they held hers without effort. She had said "Your Grace" because that was what she was supposed to say. He had asked her to dance. She had said no, not because she was playing a game, because Lady Alderton's knees had been aching all evening, and Maren had promised she would stay close in case the old woman needed to leave early. She told him this. She did not soften it. She did not apologize. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had nodded and stepped back, and something in his face had changed. Not disappointment. Interest. That was when Cordelia moved. Lady Cordelia Marsh had been raised in a house where unkindness was a sport. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Clean, bright, made to cut. She had watched the Duke cross to Maren, and she had watched him walk away, and something in her face had gone very still. She crossed the room in a glide of pale silk and stopped beside Maren with the precision of a woman who had done this before. "Lady Alderton," Cordelia said, smiling at the old woman. "How good of you to come. And you brought your companion." She turned to Maren. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "How thoughtful of you to dress her so well, Lady Alderton. One can barely tell she is staff." The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Maren felt the room go quiet around her. Not silent. There was still music, still the rustle of silk, still the clink of a glass somewhere. But the quiet was in the people. Heads turned. Eyes found her. The heat of all that attention pressed against her chest like a hand. Lady Alderton's hand tightened on her cane. "Maren is my companion, Cordelia. She is not staff. She is a guest in my home." "A guest who is paid to be in your home," Cordelia said. She tilted her head. Her voice was light and clear, and it carried. She meant it to carry. "Miss Maren, you are not a guest tonight. You are a companion in a borrowed gown. The Duke's notice does not change your wages." There it was. The sentence that landed like a slap. Maren felt it on her skin, in her chest, in the roots of her hair. The room held its breath. Someone behind her laughed. Quiet. Quickly swallowed. But Maren heard it. She did not cry. She did not look at Cordelia. She did not look at the people watching. She looked at Lady Alderton. The old woman's face was red, and her mouth was set in a hard line, and her hand was shaking on her cane. She was angry. For Maren. That anger, more than anything Cordelia had said, was what made Maren's throat tighten. "Lady Alderton," Maren said quietly. "I think I would like some air." She smoothed the front of her gown with both hands. One pass. Slow, the silk was warm under her fingers. She had worn it like armor, and now the armor had been pulled off her in front of everyone, and she was standing in a room full of strangers in nothing but her own skin. She turned. She did not curtsy to Cordelia. She did not nod. She simply turned, and she walked toward the door. This was the slow part. The part where time stretched, and the world became very clear, and every small thing was separate and sharp. She felt the weight of each step. The floor beneath her slippers was smooth stone, and she could feel the cold of it through the thin soles. The music played on, a country dance, and the fiddles soared through the air above her head. She passed a group of young women who stopped talking as she went by. She passed a man with a glass of wine who turned to watch her. She passed a servant carrying a tray of champagne, and the servant's eyes met hers for a single beat, and in that look was something she did not expect. Recognition, not of her name, of what it feels like to be looked through. She reached the door. The footman opened it. The night air hit her face like cold water, and the smell of the ballroom fell away behind her, replaced by the smell of wet gravel and the dark green scent of the gardens beyond the drive. She did not look back. Her back was straight. Her chin was level. She walked down the steps of Lady Phipps's house and out into the September night, and the gravel crunched under her shoes, and the sound was the loudest thing in the world. Behind her, the door closed. The music became muffled. Then it was just her and the night. Maren walked to the edge of the drive and stopped. The lanterns along the path threw small circles of gold on the ground, and between the circles the dark was complete. The air was cool but not cold, and it carried the smell of rain that had fallen earlier. Wet stone, soaked earth, leaves heavy with water. She pressed her hand against the stone pillar at the gate. The stone was damp and cold under her palm, and she held it there, and she breathed. She did not weep. What she felt was smaller than weeping and heavier. It was the feeling of having been seen clearly by someone who did not care what they saw. Cordelia had looked at her and seen only what she was paid to be, not what she was. The difference was the wound. She breathed in. She breathed out. The stone was cold under her hand. A horse stamped somewhere in the dark, and the sound of the harness jingled, and then it was quiet again. She let go of the pillar. She straightened her spine. She began to walk. Lady Alderton's house was 2 miles down the road. Maren had come in the carriage with the old woman. She would walk home. It was not far. She had walked farther in her life, in worse shoes, in colder weather. She knew what she was doing. She walked. The road was dark. The moon was behind clouds, and the only light was the pale wash of sky above the hedgerows. Her shoes were thin, and the gravel gave way to dirt, and the dirt was soft from the rain, and it stuck to the soles and made each step heavier than the last. The air smelled of turned earth, and the last of the summer hay drying in the fields. An owl called from somewhere in the dark. One low note, repeated, like a question no one could answer. Inside the ballroom, Alastair Hale stood near the far wall with a glass of wine he had not touched. He had watched the whole thing. He had watched Cordelia cross the room. He had watched her speak. He had not heard the words, not all of them, but he had seen the room go still, and he had seen Maren's face, and he had seen her walk out. He had not moved. He should have. He knew that. A man of his station could have ended it with a word, a look, a step forward. He had not taken that step. He had stood there like a man watching a house burn from across a river, knowing the water was too deep to cross in time. He set down the wine glass. It was warm in his hand, and he did not want warm wine. He wanted cold air. He wanted quiet. He wanted to understand why the sight of Maren walking out of that room had felt like something being torn loose inside his chest. He was not a man given to strong feeling. He had been raised to be steady. His father had taught him that a duke does not react. A duke acts. There was a difference, his father had said, between the two, and the difference was everything. Reaction was the servant's business. Action was the master's. He had reacted tonight. He had stood and watched and done nothing, and the nothing had sat in him like a stone. He left the ballroom. He did not explain himself to anyone. He crossed the hall, took his coat from the footman, and walked out into the night. The air was cool on his face. The gravel was wet under his boots. He looked down the road and saw nothing. She was already gone. He walked anyway. He found her a half-mile down the road. She was walking on the grass verge, where the ground was softer, and her shoes were dark with wet. She walked with a steady rhythm, her arms at her sides, her head up. She was not hurrying. She was not stumbling. She walked like a person who had somewhere to be and intended to get there on her own. He came up beside her. He did not touch her. He did not speak at first. He matched her pace, his long strides shortening to meet hers, and they walked in silence for several steps before she turned her head and looked at him. "You should go back," she said. "No, you should not be here, Your Grace." "And yet here I am." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. They stood on the grass verge in the dark, and the smell of wet earth was strong around them, and somewhere far away a night bird called once and then was silent. "I do not need you to rescue me," Marin said. Her voice was quiet and level. "I do not need a duke to follow me out of a ballroom so that people can say he felt sorry for the companion. That is not kindness, that is performance." He looked at her. In the dark he could see the shape of her face, but not the color of her eyes. He could see that her hands were at her sides, and they were not shaking. "I did not come because I felt sorry for you," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. The night was very still. The air smelled of rain and grass and the faintest trace of smoke from a chimney somewhere ahead. "Because you curtsied to her," he said, "before you left. You did not curtsy. I watched. You turned and walked out, and your back was the straightest thing in that room. Everyone else was bent with pretending. You were the only one standing straight." She stared at him. "That is not a reason to follow someone into the dark. It is the only reason I have." She turned and began walking again. Faster now. He kept pace. He did not try to slow her or stop her. He simply walked beside her, and the silence between them was not comfortable. But it was honest, and there was something in it that neither of them tried to fill. They walked like that for a long time. A mile. More. The road curved through farmland, and the fields on either side were dark and smelled of turned soil and the last of the summer grass. Marin's shoes were soaked through. She could feel the water between her toes, cold and sharp. She did not complain. She did not ask him to slow down or speed up or leave. When they reached the gate of Lady Alderton's house, she stopped. The house was dark except for one window on the ground floor, the drawing room, where a single candle still burned. Lady Alderton was waiting. "Go home, Your Grace," Marin said. "I will see you inside." "You will not. Lady Alderton does not need a duke in her drawing room at this hour, and I do not need an escort to my own door." He stood at the gate. She walked up the path. She did not look back. The door opened, and Lady Alderton's face appeared in the light, and then the door closed, and he was alone on the road. He stood there for a long time. The night was cool, and his coat was thin, and the damp was seeping into his chest. He did not care. He was thinking about the way she had walked, not fleeing, not running, just walking, as if the direction she had chosen was the only one that made sense, as if the road was hers and the ballroom was theirs, and she had chosen the road. He turned and walked home. It was 3 miles to Thornwood Hall. He walked every step. The gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt to mud, and his boots were heavy by the time he reached his own door. The house was dark. The staff was asleep. He let himself in through the side entrance and stood in the cold kitchen, and the stone floor was like ice under his shoes, and the air smelled of bread from the morning's baking, and he stood there and thought about her back. The straightness of it, the way it held, the way it did not bend. He went to his study. He did not light a lamp. He sat in the dark, and the leather of his chair was cold against his back, and he thought about what kind of man watches a woman be cut down in a room full of people and does nothing. He knew the answer. He was that man. And the knowing was worse than the doing, because the doing could be fixed, and the knowing could not. The days that followed were not easy for Marin. Lady Alderton was furious. Not at Marin. At Cordelia. The old woman wrote letters. She made threats. She spoke of leaving the district entirely. Marin calmed her. She made tea. She sat with her. She did not speak of the ball again unless Lady Alderton raised it, and when Lady Alderton raised it, Marin said, "It is done. Let it be done." But it was not done. The district was small, and news travelled fast. Within a week, Marin knew that the story had been told and retold at every dinner table and tea party for 20 miles. The details changed in the telling. In some versions, Marin had wept. In others, she had argued. In the worst version, she had been thrown out. None of these were true. But truth was not what people wanted. They wanted a story. She had become one. She kept to her routine. She read to Lady Alderton in the mornings. The old woman liked novels, the long kind with many pages and many heartbreaks, and Marin read them in a steady voice while Lady Alderton sat in her chair by the fire and knitted things she never finished. The fire was always lit in the drawing room, even in September, because Lady Alderton's bones were old and cold lived in them. The wool of the knitting smelled of lanolin, and the fire smelled of ash and dry wood, and Marin read, and the old woman knitted, and the morning passed. In the afternoons, Marin walked to the village. She visited the schoolroom where the village children gathered twice a week, and she taught them their letters, and she did not pretend that the whispers stopped when she entered a room. She heard them. She kept walking. The village smelled of bread from the baker's oven, and the sharp tang of the smith's fire, and the cobblestones were uneven under her feet, and she walked them anyway, and her back was straight, and her head was up, and she did not bend. It was during this time that the Duke began to appear. Not grandly, not with announcement. He came to call on Lady Alderton, who was his aunt, and he sat in her drawing room and drank her tea and spoke to her about the estate and the harvest and the price of wheat. Marin was there for most of these visits because she was always there. Lady Alderton's companion was always there, and the Duke spoke to her with the same quiet courtesy he spoke to everyone. But Marin noticed things. She noticed that he listened when she spoke, not the polite listening of a man waiting for his turn to talk. The real kind. The kind where his eyes stayed on her face and his body went still, and he heard what she was saying, not what he expected her to say. She noticed that he did not mention the ball. Not once. He did not ask about it. He did not apologize for not acting. He did not offer comfort. He simply showed up, week after week, and sat in the same chair and drank the same tea, and was there. She did not know what to do with this. She had expected him to forget. Men of his station forgot things like that. A companion was humiliated at a ball. What of it? There were other balls, other companions, other nights. But he did not forget. He came back. And the coming back was harder to resist than any grand gesture, because there was nothing to resist. He was not trying to win anything. He was just there. One afternoon in early October, Marin walked to the village school as she did every week. The school was a single room behind the church, and the children sat on benches, and the light came through windows that did not close properly. And the floor was cold stone, and Marin loved it. She loved the way the children looked at her when she opened a book. Not with blankness, with hunger. They wanted the stories. They wanted the words. The room smelled of chalk dust and damp wool, and the sound of the children's voices was high and bright, and Marin read to them and helped them with their letters and felt. For the first time since the ball, like herself. Among the children was a boy named Robbie Bray. He was 5 years old, small for his age, with a round face and dark eyes that followed Marin like two small moons. He did not speak much. He was the quietest child in the room, but he was the one who always sat closest, and he was the one who always stayed after the others had gone. Turning the pages of the one book Marin had brought, tracing the letters with his finger. His hands were small and dirty and careful, and he touched the page as if the words might break. His mother, Mrs. Bray, was a widow. She worked in the fields from dawn to dark, and Robbie spent his days with his grandmother, who was old and tired, and who often fell asleep in her chair while the boy played at her feet. Marin had noticed this. She had begun keeping Robbie after the lessons, letting him sit with her while she tidied the schoolroom. She did not tell anyone about this. It was not a plan. It was just what she did. The boy needed someone awake near him. She was awake. It was during one of these afternoons that Mrs. Bray came to the schoolroom door. She was flushed and out of breath, and her hands were red from the cold, and her boots were caked with mud. She looked at Marin, and her face did something complicated. Relief and shame and gratitude all pressed together like flowers dried between pages. "The rent," Mrs. Bray said. "It is paid. Someone paid it. All of it. The arrears and the quarter ahead." Marin stared at her. "Who?" The landlord would not say. He said only that it was taken care of, and I was not to worry. Mrs. Bray's eyes were bright. "I thought it was you." "It was not me," Marin said. She felt something move in her chest. "I do not have that kind of money." Mrs. Bray wiped her hands on her apron. "Then I do not know. But whoever it was, they saved us. They saved our home." She looked at Robbie, who was sitting on the floor turning the pages of his book, and her mouth trembled. He would have lost the only roof he has ever known. Marin did not find out who had paid the rent for another 2 weeks. It was Lady Alderton who told her, without meaning to. The old woman was going through her correspondence at the breakfast table, and she said, in the absent way she said most things before her morning tea, that Alistair had been busy. He had settled the rents for 3 families in the village. 3. He had not told her himself. She had heard it from the vicar. Marin set down her teacup. The porcelain was warm against her fingers, and the tea smelled of bergamot, and the morning light was grey through the window, and she felt something shift inside her. Not a grand feeling. Not love. Something quieter. The feeling of learning that a man she had thought was only present was also paying attention. Not to her, but to the things she cared about. The things she had not asked anyone to care about. The Bray family. The school. The children who sat on cold stone floors and traced letters with dirty fingers. She did not mention it to him. He never mentioned it to her. That was the point. The wagon came on a Tuesday. It was the middle of October. The days had turned cool, and the mornings were damp, and the leaves on the trees along the road had gone the colour of rust and honey. Marin had walked to the village as she always did, carrying a basket with bread and a jar of honey that Lady Alderton had asked her to bring to Mrs. Bray. The road was quiet. The sky was pale, the colour of old linen, and the air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves, and the sharp green scent of the ditch water running along the verge. She passed the smithy, where the hammer rang against the anvil in a steady beat that she could feel in her teeth. She passed the church, where the vicar was sweeping the steps, his broom scratching against the stone. She turned onto the lane that led to the Bray cottage, a narrow track bordered by hedgerows that were still thick with blackberries. The berries were past their best, soft and dark, and the smell of them was sweet and faintly sharp, the smell of things rotting back into the earth. The lane was uneven, rutted from cartwheels, and the mud was soft under her shoes. And each step made a small sound like a mouth opening and closing. She saw Robbie before she saw anything else. He was lying at the edge of the lane, just where the hedge opened onto a small patch of grass. He was on his side, his knees drawn up, his head resting on his arm. His eyes were closed, his mouth was slightly open, his dark hair was stuck to his forehead. He was asleep. The sun had come out from behind the clouds, and the patch of grass where he lay was warm. The light lay on his face like a hand. He had probably been playing and had fallen asleep in the warmth, the way children do. Suddenly, completely, as if someone had pulled a curtain over his mind. His grandmother was nowhere in sight. She had probably dozed off again in the cottage. Marin smiled. She did not wake him. She would leave the bread with his grandmother and let him sleep. She walked past him, toward the cottage which was 30 yards up the lane. The grass whispered against her skirts. A bee moved past her ear, its sound fat and lazy, the last bee of the year. Then she heard the wagon. It was a heavy sound, the groan of wood under weight, the creak of an axle, the steady thud of hooves on packed earth. She turned and looked back down the lane. The lane curved, and she could not see far, but the sound was getting closer. A farmer's wagon, probably, bringing hay or timber from the fields beyond the village. The lane was too narrow for 2 vehicles to pass. She would step aside when it came. Then she heard the other sound. A crack. Sharp, like a branch breaking, but louder. Deeper, the sound of wood splitting under strain. The sound of iron giving way. She turned fully now. The wagon had come around the curve. It was a big wagon. 4 wheels, piled high with hay, pulled by two heavy horses whose coats were dark with sweat. The driver sat on the bench, and he was pulling on the reins, but his face was wrong. It was white. His mouth was open. He was shouting something, but the words were lost in the noise, swallowed by the groan of the wood and the pound of the hooves. The front left wheel was turning sideways. Maren saw it in the slow way that disaster reveals itself. The iron band that held the wheel together had cracked. The wood had split along the grain, and the spokes were splaying outward like fingers opening. The wheel was no longer round. It was a broken thing, and the weight of the wagon and the hay was pressing down on it, and the axle was twisting, and the whole front of the wagon was slewing to the left. To the left, toward the edge of the lane, toward the grass, toward Robbie. Time went slow. Maren felt it stretch, like honey pulling from a spoon, and every detail separated from every other detail, and each one was clear and bright and terrible. She saw the wheel break apart. She saw the wagon lurch. She saw the horses strain against the harness, their hooves sliding in the mud, their eyes white and wild, the foam flying from their mouths. She saw the hay shift on the wagon bed, bales sliding, the whole load going crooked. She saw the driver haul on the reins with everything he had, his knuckles white, his body braced, and she saw that it was not enough. The broken wheel had taken the wagon's direction, and the wagon's direction was toward the patch of warm grass where a 5-year-old boy lay sleeping in the sun. She did not think. There was no thought. There was only the seeing and the running and the terrible clarity of a single fact. Robbie was asleep, and the wagon was coming, and no one else was close enough. She ran. Her shoes hit the mud, and the sound was a wet slap, and the cold of the ground came up through the soles and into her bones. Her basket fell from her hand. She heard the jar of honey break on the stones, and the sound was small and far away and meant nothing. Her skirts caught at her knees, and she pulled them up without slowing, and the air was cold in her throat, and her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her ears, in her wrists, in the back of her neck. The wagon was 20 yards from Robbie. The horses were screaming now. The driver was screaming. The wood of the wagon was screaming. Everything was screaming. 15 yards. 10. She reached him. She did not stop to wake him. There was no time. She dropped to the ground beside him, and the grass was warm under her knees, and she could smell the hay on the wagon, and the sweat of the horses, and the iron smell of the broken wheel. And she put her body between the wagon and the child. She curled herself over him. She covered his head with her arms. She pressed her face into the grass, and the grass smelled of earth and summer and the last warm thing before winter, and she held him, and she did not let go. She felt the ground shake. She heard the screech of wood, and the crash of the hay bales falling, and the screaming of the horses, and the shouting of the driver, and then impact. The edge of the wagon caught her on the left side. The shoulder, the ribs, the force of it was like being hit by the side of a building. The air left her lungs. Pain went through her in a white wave, starting at her shoulder and ending somewhere in her legs. She felt herself slide across the grass, and she felt Robbie's small body under her, and she held him tighter, and the world went bright, and then dark, and then bright again. The wagon passed over them. Not fully. She had been at the edge of its path, not in the center. The broken wheel had caught the worst of the weight, and the wagon had tilted, and the hay bales had spilled, and the horses had veered, and the driver had hauled them to a stop 10 feet past where Maren lay. Then it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a sound too big to follow. The kind that fills the space where noise was and presses against the ears. Maren lay on the grass. Her left arm was wrong. She could feel it hanging at an angle that arms were not meant to hang, and the pain was a deep red thing that pulsed with every beat of her heart. Her ribs ached. Her face was in the grass, and she could smell the earth and the broken hay and the honey from the jar that had shattered on the stones. She could feel Robbie under her, small and warm and still. She could feel his chest rising and falling. He was breathing. He was alive. He was awake now. She felt him stir under her, felt his small hands push against her, heard his voice. Thin, frightened, a child's voice calling for his mother. She tried to move. The pain stopped her. She turned her head, and the world swam, and she saw the sky, pale, flat, the color of old linen, and the hedge, and the broken wagon, and the hay scattered across the lane like gold, and the driver on the ground beside his horses. And then she saw something else. She saw the Duke. He was running. He was running down the lane toward her, and his coat was open, and his face was white, and he moved with a speed that did not match the steady man she had come to know. He was not a man who ran. He was a man who walked, who measured, who weighed. But he was running, and the sound of his boots on the lane was the last thing she heard before the world went dark. She woke in a bed that was not hers. The sheets were white and stiff and smelled of lye soap, and the pillow was too high, and the room was too warm. A fire burned in the grate, and the smell of wood smoke was thick in the air, and she could hear the pop and hiss of the sap in the logs. Her left arm was wrapped in something tight, and it ached with a deep, slow throb, and her ribs were bandaged, and every breath was a negotiation with pain. She turned her head. Lady Alderton was asleep in a chair beside the bed. Her chin was on her chest, and her cane was propped against the arm of the chair, and her hands were folded in her lap. She looked old, older than Maren had ever seen her look. The firelight made shadows on her face, and the shadows made her look like a woman carved from wood. The room was large, the ceiling was high, the furniture was dark wood, heavy and old, the curtains were deep red, and the colour of them in the firelight was the colour of wine. This was not Lady Alderton's house. This was Thornwood Hall. The door opened. Alistair came in. He was dressed in a shirt and waistcoat, no coat, and his hair was damp as if he had been out in the rain. He saw that she was awake, and he stopped in the doorway. His face did something she had never seen it do. It broke. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to see the crack before he put it back together. He crossed to the bed. He did not sit. He stood, and his hands were at his sides, and he looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that holds things too large for words. "Robbie," she said. Her voice was a thread. "He is well," Alistair said. "Not a scratch. His mother has him." She closed her eyes. The relief was so large it was almost another kind of pain. Her shoulder throbbed. The fire popped. Lady Alderton snored softly in her chair. The room smelled of smoke and warm linen and something else, something clean and male that she knew was him. "How long?" Maren asked. 2 days. You have been asleep for 2 days. The doctor set your arm. 2 bones broken in the lower part. Your ribs are bruised but not broken. You lost blood from a cut on your head," he said. He stopped. He said what? He said if you had been 3 inches to the right, the wheel would have taken your head. She opened her eyes. He was still standing there. His hands were at his sides, but she could see that his fingers were curled. Not clenched, just curled. The way a man holds his hands when he is stopping himself from doing something. "Why am I here?" she asked. "At Thornwood. Lady Alderton's house has no room suitable for recovery. The bed is too small. The staff is too thin. I offered my home." She agreed. She agreed, or you told her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of one. She agreed. Maren looked at the fire. The logs were shifting, settling into each other, and the flames were low and orange, and the heat of them reached her face. She was tired. The pain was a heavy blanket over her body, and it pulled her down. "Your Grace," she said. "Alistair," he said. She did not answer that. She let her eyes close, and the dark was warm and soft, and she felt his presence in the room like the heat of the fire. Not touching her. But there. The days of recovery were long. Maren could not use her left arm, and the ribs made it hard to sit up, and the first week she spent mostly in bed, staring at the ceiling of the guest chamber at Thornwood Hall, and listening to the sounds of a house she did not know. The sound of boots in the hall below, the sound of a door closing, the sound of the clock in the front hall striking the hours, deep, slow, the kind of sound that lived in the walls of old houses. Alastair visited her every day. He did not come at the same time. He did not stay for the same length. He brought things. Books from his library, a pot of tea, a shawl that smelled of cedar when she wrapped it around her shoulders. He did not fawn. He did not hover. He sat in the chair beside her bed and spoke to her about ordinary things. The weather, the estate, a fence that needed mending in the lower field. He spoke as if she were a person, not a patient. She was grateful for that. She was also aware of him in ways she did not want to be. She noticed the way he held a book, loosely in one hand, as if reading were breathing. She noticed the way he paused before he spoke, as if he were choosing his words from a shelf and setting each one down carefully. She noticed that he smelled of soap and leather and the faintest trace of horse, and that underneath all of it was something warm and clean that she could not name and did not try to. She healed slowly. By the second week, she could sit up. By the third, she could walk, though not far and not fast. The arm was still in a sling, and the ribs still ached when she breathed too deeply, but she could move. She began to take small walks through the house. Thornwood Hall was old and large and beautiful in the way that old houses are. Not polished, not grand, but settled. The wood floors creaked under her feet, and the sound was a language the house spoke, and she was learning it. The walls were thick, the windows were tall and narrow, and the light that came through them was thin and gold, and it lay on the floors in long stripes that moved as the day passed. She found the library on her fourth day of walking. It was a room at the back of the house, and the walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, and the smell of old paper and leather bindings was so strong it was almost a taste, dry and sweet and faintly dusty. A fire was already burning in the grate. She had not lit it. Someone had. She sat in the chair closest to the fire. The leather was worn and soft, and it was warm from the heat, and she sank into it, and she pulled the cedar-scented shawl around her shoulders, and she let the warmth of the fire sink into her bones. She closed her eyes. The house was quiet around her. She could hear the clock in the hall, faint and steady. She could hear the wind against the windows. She could hear, somewhere far away, the sound of a door. She opened a book. She read. The words came slowly at first, as if her mind were still catching up with her body, but then they flowed, and she was inside the story, and the pain in her arm and her ribs went far away. That was how he found her. He came to the door of the library and stopped. She looked up. He looked at her, in the chair, with the shawl, with the book, and something in his face went quiet. "I see you found the library," he said. "It found me," she said. He almost smiled. Almost, then he crossed to the shelf on the far wall, took down a book, and sat in the chair across from her. He did not speak. She did not speak. They read in the same room, and the fire burned between them. And the silence was the kind that does not need filling. This became a habit. Every afternoon Maren came to the library. Every afternoon the fire was already lit. Every afternoon Alastair appeared, and sat in the chair across from her, and read. They did not plan this. Neither of them said, "Shall we read together today?" It simply happened, the way habits do. One day, and then the next, and then the next, until the shape of it became part of the shape of the house. They began to talk during these afternoons, not about feelings, about books, about the world, about the things they had read and the things they thought. Maren discovered that he had opinions about everything and shared almost none of them unless asked. She discovered that when she asked, his answers were careful and honest, and sometimes surprising. He discovered that she had read more books than anyone he had ever met, and that she remembered every one of them, and that she could talk about them the way some people talk about food. With hunger, with joy. She discovered one afternoon that he kept a small leather notebook in his coat pocket, and that he wrote in it sometimes, quickly, with a stub of pencil, when he thought no one was looking. She did not ask what he wrote. He did not offer. But she saw one day that the notebook was open on his knee, and on the page was a single line in his heavy handwriting. She could not read it from where she sat. She did not try. But she saw that the line was short, and that he looked at it for a long time before he closed the book and put it away. He discovered, one morning when she did not know he was watching, that she hummed while she read. Not a tune, just a low sound in her throat, like a cat purring, that she seemed not to know she was making. He stood in the corridor outside the library and listened, and the sound was so small and so private that he felt as if he had opened a door he should not have opened. He did not enter. He stood there, and he listened, and then he walked away, and he did not mention it. It was on the 7th day of her recovery that Cordelia came. Maren was in the garden. It was a small garden behind the house, bordered by a stone wall, and the last roses of the season were still holding on. Pale pink, almost white, their petals softening at the edges, turning brown where they touched the stem. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of the dying roses, and the sun was out, and it was warm on her face. She was sitting on the stone bench, her sling carefully arranged, watching a bee move across the last open rose. The bee was slow. The cold would take it soon. But it was still moving, still trying. She heard the crunch of gravel on the drive. She heard the sound of a carriage, light, well sprung, the kind that belonged to money. She did not think anything of it. Thornwood Hall had visitors. Then she heard the voice. Miss Maren. What a surprise. Cordelia stood at the garden gate. She was dressed in a riding habit of dark blue, and her hair was swept up under a small hat, and she looked as if she had been poured into her clothes by someone who measured every fold. She held the gate with one gloved hand, and her smile was the same blade smile Maren remembered from the ball. I heard about your accident, Cordelia said. She stepped through the gate and into the garden. Her boots were clean. Her gloves were white. She looked at the stone bench, at the sling, at Maren's face, and her eyes took it all in with the slow satisfaction of a woman checking on damage she had helped to cause. How dramatic. Throwing oneself in front of a wagon. One might think you were trying to be noticed. The words came out light, easy, as if she were discussing the weather, but they carried the same blade as the night at the ball, the same intent, to cut, to reduce, to take something brave and make it small. Maren looked at her. The sun was warm on her face. The bee had left the rose and was buzzing somewhere near the wall. She could smell the roses and the earth and the faintest trace of Cordelia's perfume, lavender and something sharp underneath. No, Maren said. I was trying to keep a child alive. How noble. Cordelia tilted her head. And now you are recovering at Thornwood Hall. How convenient. One might think you planned the whole thing. One might, Maren said. If one were the sort of person who planned such things. I am not, and I think you know that. Cordelia's smile flickered, just for a moment. Then it came back, wider, brighter, thinner. I came to see the Duke. I have business with him. Family business. You need not concern yourself. I do not concern myself with your business, Lady Cordelia. I never have. No, you concern yourself with far grander things, it seems. Wagons and children and the Duke's guest room. Cordelia paused. Her voice dropped, and the softness in it was worse than the sharpness. You are very clever, Miss Maren. But clever does not last. Position does. And you, my dear, will never have position, no matter how many children you save. Maren felt the words. She felt them the way she had felt the wagon, a force that hit her body and tried to move her, but she was sitting on a stone bench in the sun, and her arm was broken, and her ribs were bruised, and she had thrown herself in front of a wagon for a boy she loved, and she was not going to be moved by a woman who thought unkindness was a sport. I do not want your position, Maren said. She said it quietly. She said it the way she said everything. Without performance, without heat, without trying to be anything other than what she was. I have never wanted it. You can keep it. All of it. The gowns and the balls and the way you speak to people you think are beneath you. Keep it. I would not trade places with you for all the position in England. The garden was very quiet. The bee had stopped buzzing, the roses hung still on their stems, the air smelled of earth and dying flowers and the sharp trace of lavender. Cordelia's face was white, not with anger, with something else, something that looked, for just a moment, like the face of a woman who has been seen clearly and does not like what is seen. Maren heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She knew who it was. She could feel his presence the way she felt the sun. Without looking, without thinking. "I believe you were looking for me, Cordelia," Alistair said. His voice was level. He did not come to stand beside Maren. He did not put himself between them. He stood at the edge of the garden, near the door, and he looked at Cordelia with the heavy grey gaze that Maren had first seen across a ballroom. Cordelia looked at him. She looked at Maren. She looked at the sling, at the bench, at the roses. Something in her face shifted, the calculation, the measuring, the weighing of what she had against what she could lose. She was not stupid. She was cruel, but she was not stupid. She could see what was in this garden. She could see what was in the way he stood, in the way he looked at Maren. Not with pity, not with duty, with the quiet attention of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. "I will call another time," Cordelia said. Her voice was smooth again. The blade was sheathed. "When you are less occupied." She turned. She walked through the gate. Her boots crunched on the gravel. The carriage door opened and closed. The horses moved. The sound of the wheels faded down the drive, and then there was silence. Maren let out a breath. It hurt her ribs. She did not care. Alistair crossed the garden. He sat on the bench beside her. Not close. Not far. He set his hands on his knees. He looked at the roses. He did not look at her. "You heard," she said. "Some of it. All of it." He did not deny it. "You did not need me." "No, but I was here." She looked at him. His profile was sharp against the pale sky. His jaw was set. His hands were still on his knees, but she could see the tension in them. The same quiet holding she had seen the day he stood over her bed. "Why did you chase me that night?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. The sun moved behind a cloud, and the garden went cool, and the smell of the roses grew stronger in the sudden shade, and then the sun came back, and the warmth returned. A bird sang in the hedgerow beyond the wall. 2 notes, repeated, as if it were trying to remember a song. "Because I have been in rooms like that my whole life," he said. Rooms full of people performing, smiling because they must, saying what they are supposed to say. I have watched hundreds of women curtsy and smile and say what they thought I wanted to hear. And that night, I watched a woman in a borrowed gown get called a servant in front of 300 people, and she did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not argue. She walked out of that room like she had somewhere better to be, and she did not look back. He paused. The birds sang again. The roses were still. The sun was warm. "I have never seen anyone leave like that," he said. "Not once, not in 32 years. And I thought, if she can walk out of that room with her spine straight and her head up, then maybe I have been in the wrong rooms my whole life. And I wanted to know where she was going. I wanted to know what it looked like, to be that sure of who you are." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I followed you because you were the only honest thing in that room. And I have been following you ever since. Not because I feel sorry for you. Because you are the first person I have met who does not pretend." Maren did not speak. She sat on the stone bench with her broken arm in its sling, and her bruised ribs aching with every breath, and the sun was warm on her face, and the roses smelled sweet and sad, and she felt something open inside her. Not a door, not a gate. Something deeper. Something that had been closed for a long time. So long she had forgotten it was there. She looked at him. He was still looking at his hands. "Alistair," she said. He looked up. She did not say anything else. She said his name. Just his name. The way he had said hers, that night at the ball. As if it were a word she had always known. As if it were the only word that mattered. He did not move. He did not reach for her. He sat on the bench beside her, and the sun was on both of them. And the garden was quiet, and the roses were dying and beautiful, and she had said his name, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were not sudden. Nothing between them was sudden. Maren's arm healed. The bones knit, slowly, the way bones do, aching as they grew back together. Stiff when she tried to move her fingers, tender when the weather changed. She stayed at Thornwood Hall. Lady Alderton came to visit and declared that the house was better for having someone young in it, and that Maren should stay until she was fully recovered, and that was that. Maren stayed. She walked in the garden. She read in the library. She ate her meals at the long table in the dining room, where the candlelight made the silver glow and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. And Alistair sat at the other end, and they spoke about the day and the estate and the books they were reading, and the distance between them was not distance. It was space. There is a difference. Distance is a thing that separates. Space is a thing that holds. She went back to the village school when her arm was out of the sling. Robbie ran to her when she walked through the door. Ran full tilt, his arms out, his face split open with a grin. She caught him with her good arm and held him, and he smelled of bread and soap and little boy sweat, and she felt his heart beating against hers, and she thought, This is what I almost died for. And it was worth it. Mrs. Bray wept. She did not try to hide it. She stood in the doorway of the schoolroom with her red hands clasped together and her face wet, and she said, You saved my boy. You saved my boy. And Maren said, He saved himself. He was sleeping. He did not even know. And Mrs. Bray said, But you knew. You knew, and you stayed. And Maren did not have an answer for that, because it was true. She had known, and she had stayed, and the staying had cost her 2 broken bones and a scar on the back of her hand and a bed in a duke's house and a name spoken in a garden that had changed everything. She saw the headstone on her mother's grave the next Sunday. She had not been to the churchyard in months. The grave was at the back, under a yew tree, and there had never been a stone, just a wooden marker that the rain and the years had worn smooth. But now there was a stone. Small, simple, grey, with her mother's name carved into it, and the dates of her birth and death, and below them a single line. She was kind. Maren stood in front of it for a long time. The yew tree was dark above her. The grass was wet. The church bell rang in the tower above her, and the sound was deep and slow, and it moved through her chest like a second heartbeat. The stone was cold when she touched it. The carved letters were rough under her fingers. She traced them, her mother's name, the dates, the line. She was kind. She did not ask him about it. She did not need to. The stone said what he could not. And the words he had chosen were not the words of a man trying to win something. They were the words of a man who had listened to a woman talk about her mother on a rainy afternoon in a library, and had remembered, and had done something about it, and had told no one. It was November when the last piece fell into place. The air had turned cold. The trees along the drive were bare, their branches black against a sky the colour of pewter, and the wind smelled of frost and the coming winter. Maren was in the library. The fire was lit. The cedar shawl was around her shoulders. She was reading, and the house was quiet, and the clock in the hall struck 4, and she heard his step in the corridor. She knew his step now. She knew it the way she knew the sound of the clock and the creak of the floor. It was part of the house. It was part of her. He came to the door. He stopped. He looked at her, the way he always looked at her, with that heavy quiet attention that was not staring and was not watching, but something in between. Something that said, I see you. I have seen you. I will keep seeing you. She looked up from her book. The firelight was on his face. His shirt was white, and his waistcoat was dark, and his hair was falling forward the way it did when he had been working all day. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was almost ready to set it down. She did not say anything. She moved the book from the chair beside her to the small table at her elbow. The chair was empty. The space was open. She did not say sit. She did not say, "Come in." She moved the book. That was all. He looked at the empty chair. He looked at her. He crossed the room. He sat down. The fire burned. The clock ticked. The wind moved against the windows, and the glass rattled in its frame. And the sound was small and sharp, and then it was gone. The house held them the way old houses do. Not with warmth, but with the steady, quiet certainty of a thing that has stood for a long time and intends to stand for longer. She set down her book. She turned her hand on the arm of the chair, palm up. It was the hand of the broken arm, the left one, the one that had taken the worst of the wagon. It was healed now. The bones were whole. The skin was smooth. There was a scar on the back of it, thin and pale, where the edge of the wagon had caught her. The scar was the shape of a crescent, and in the firelight it looked like a small white moon. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His eyes were grey and heavy and full of something that she had never seen in them before. Not because it had not been there, but because she had not been ready to see it. Now she was ready. Now she saw it. And what she saw was the same thing she had seen the night he ran down a lane after her with his coat open and his face white. The same thing she had seen when he stood over her bed and his face broke for just a moment. The same thing she had seen in the garden when she said his name and he did not move. It was the look of a man who had found something he did not know he was looking for, and was afraid to touch it in case it was not real. She kept her hand where it was, palm up, open, on the arm of the chair. He put his hand in hers. His fingers were warm. His palm was rough. He held her hand the way he did everything, quietly, carefully, as if it were the most important thing he had ever done. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The clock struck the half-hour. The light moved across the floor, slow and gold, and the library smelled of old paper and wood smoke and cedar, and their hands were together on the arm of the chair, and the silence was not silence. It was the sound of two people who had found each other in the dark and decided, without words, to stay. She had walked out of a ballroom with her spine straight and her head up, and he had followed her into the night because she was the only honest thing he had ever seen. She had thrown herself in front of a wagon for a sleeping child, and he had run down a lane after her with his coat open and his heart in his mouth. She had said his name in a garden, and he had heard in it the sound of a door opening that he had thought would always be closed. And now they were here, in a library, in a house that was beginning to feel like home, with their hands together and the fire between them and the winter coming. And neither of them afraid. Maren turned her head and looked at him. He was already looking at her. Their eyes met, and neither of them looked away, and the moment stretched the way the best moments do. Slow, clear, full of everything that had come before. The ballroom, the road, the rain, the wagon, the broken arm, the garden, the roses, the name spoken in the sun, the stone on the grave that said, "She was kind." All of it had led here, to this room, to this fire, to this hand in this hand. "You stayed," she said. He squeezed her hand. Once gentle, the way a man holds something he knows the worth of. "So did you," he said. The fire burned low. The room grew dark. The first snow of winter began to fall outside the window, soft and quiet, and it covered the garden and the lane, and the place where the wagon had come to rest, and it covered everything in white. And the world was new. And in the library at Thornwood Hall, two people sat in chairs by a fire that was slowly going out, and their hands were together. And the silence between them was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have said everything that matters, and are resting in the truth of it. And the house held them, and the snow fell, and the night came on, and they stayed. They stayed, and the staying was the bravest thing either of them had ever done, and the winter that came was long and cold and full of quiet, and they did not mind it. Because the cold was outside and the warmth was in, and some things, once found, are never let go.